This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
Hi everyone, and welcome to a spooky MTG Top 10. Every Friday this month I'll be doing a Halloween-inspired MTG Top 10, and today we're starting with a look at Innistrad Midnight Hunt, a set that came out in 2022, and it might just be the spookiest Magic set we've ever seen. While Innistrad has some new competition in Duskmourn, I still think it's Magic's spookiest plain. I've covered many other Innistrad sets and spooky MTG Top 10s in years past as a result, and Midnight Hunt in particular has some serious autumnal vibes since the story revolves around a harvest festival. It's also a good time to do a retrospective on the set in general, since it just recently rotated out of Standard. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. This means that cards like Delver of Secrets and Duress, which would have made the list, aren't eligible because they're reprints. Furthermore, I excluded the set's dual land cycle. All dual lands see a ton of play, you don't really need me to tell you that, and they aren't particularly interesting to talk about anyway. Even removing those cards from the mix, this list is very stacked. Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards have affected and are affecting multiple 60-card formats. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Brutal Cathar, and yeah, it took 76 points to make this list. That's more than the number 1 card on many top 10s, but Midnight Hunt is so stacked that 76 points was barely enough to make it. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/2, and when it enters or transforms into Brutal Cathar, you exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. As a Midnight Hunt werewolf, it also comes with Daybound and Nightbound, which means that this creature is different depending on whether it's daytime or nighttime. It becomes daytime when you play a card with Daybound, and then if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night on the next turn. And when it becomes night, or if it's night when you cast Brutal Cathar, it's Moonrage Brute, a 3/3 with First Strike and Ward, pay 3 life. The Cathar is a Banisher Priest type creature that exiles something, but if you can go back and forth enough between day and night, you can exile more than 1 creature with it, and when it's nighttime, you have a pretty good attacker, so you sort of get removal and an aggro creature all in one. It's put up points in Standard, Historic, and Pioneer White Weenie decks, and it's still seeing play in Pioneer right now. Despite that, it's hard to say whether it will be able to move higher on the list because the cards in front of it are all active too. At number 9, it's Play with Fire. For 1 red mana, it's an instant that does 2 to any target, and if it damages a player that way, you scry 1. That's a super simple card, but it's the kind of card that always sees play. 1 mana to deal 2 plays well in virtually every Standard format, and this is a pretty good version of it because it's a strictly better shock. It can efficiently get a blocker or otherwise problematic creature out of the way, or you can go face with it and scry when you do. The scry is no small thing either, as the decks that often want to point this at a player really need to make sure they don't draw into any lands. They need more burn after all, and scry 1 can help you with that. Unsurprisingly, it saw play in a lot of red decks while it was in Standard, especially in mono red. In Pioneer, it's been played in lots of different red aggro decks, including Prowess and Gruul, and it's even been good enough to find some success in Modern Burn in red deck wins. It's going to continue to be active, especially in Pioneer. At number 8, it's Storm the Festival. For 3 generic and 3 green, it's a sorcery that lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you can put 2 permanent cards from among them with mana value 5 or less onto the battlefield. It also has Flashback for 7 generic and 3 green. So, if you have powerful cards with the right mana value, you can get a pretty massive discount on putting them into play, and obviously the decks that use Storm the Festival are adept at doing exactly that. While it's been played a little bit in Standard and Modern, Pioneer is where Storm the Festival has been the most prolific. There, it's been part of Devotion to Green decks since the day it got printed. Those decks are good at generating the mana to cast this normally or from the graveyard thanks to Mana Elves and Nykthos. And they run super powerful permanents with ideal mana values, like Cavalier of Thorns and Nissa who shakes the world. Getting those two into play for 6 mana is pretty absurd. Devotion to Green decks have been at the top of the format for a while now, and even various bans haven't been able to keep them down entirely, and that means Storm the Festival is going to keep seeing play in Pioneer. At number 7, we've got the second werewolf on the list, which makes sense since Midnight Hunt is supposed to be the werewolf set. This one is Graveyard Trespasser. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 3/3 with Ward, discard a card, and when it enters or attacks, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and if it was a creature card, each opponent loses 1 life and gains 1 life. Like all Midnight Hunt werewolves, it has the whole daybound, nightbound thing going on too. The nightbound side here is Graveyard Glutton, a 4/4 with the same ward and a similar enters and attacks trigger, but it exiles 2 cards instead. The Trespasser is a super efficient and effective way to disrupt graveyard strategies while also making life a lot harder for aggro decks, since any amount of life gain can often derail their entire game plan. The ward that this has also means the best your opponent can usually do against it is 2 for 1 themselves. All of that power has led to the Trespasser having multi-format success, where it's especially attractive for mid-range decks in pretty much every format. These days it's seeing lots of play in both Pioneer and Modern, and it's one of the more active cards on the bottom part of this list, so there's a real chance it moves higher. At number 6, it's Adeline Resplendent Cathar. For 1 generic and 2 white, you get a star 4 with vigilance and power equal to the number of creatures you control. Whenever you attack for each opponent, you make a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking. One thing that's easy to overlook here, you get that token regardless of which of your creatures attacks, and that often means you get one the turn Adeline comes down, which of course also means her power is going to be higher when it is time to attack with her on the next turn. Throw Vigilance in the mix and you have a creature you've got to worry about during every single combat. She was heavily played in Standard the entire time she was legal there, starring in straightforward white weenie decks, and when she rotated out of the format, she was being featured in Legendary Matters decks like Esper Rafine and in Boros Convoke decks. She's seen play in non-rotating formats too, putting up top finishes in Pioneer White Weenie and Modern Humans, and she's even got a single point in Legacy. Adeline is in a great spot to keep gaining points in the future, and some of the cards in front of her aren't quite as heavily played these days as she is, so there's a chance she'll move higher on the list in the future. At number 5, it's Lier, Disciple of the Drowned. For 3 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/4 that makes it so spells can't be countered, and it gives flashback to all of your instants and sorceries in the graveyard, making the flashback cost equal to the card's mana cost. In other words, you can cast those cards from your graveyard for their mana cost and then exile them. So yeah, Lier is super strong because you effectively get to have every instant and sorcery card in your graveyard in your hand. Getting that much card advantage is absurd, so if Lier stays in play when you have a well-stocked graveyard, it's usually game over for your opponent. While it was in Standard, it was played in control decks for exactly that reason. One kind of thing about Lier's design is that they gave it the spells can't be countered thing in an attempt to make Lier less good. They didn't want people to be able to cast counter spells from the graveyard because that's pretty miserable. But it actually sees play in Pioneer in part because it makes it so spells can't be countered. In that format, it mostly sees play in Lotus Field combo decks, which are all about tapping and untapping the field a whole bunch of times in a single turn, making a whole bunch of mana, drawing your entire deck, and comboing off. In that deck, Lier gives you more access to your untap effects, like Pour Over the Pages, while also making it so your opponent can't stop you from having your big turn and winning the game. Lier is going to keep gaining points in Pioneer Lotus Field decks going forward. At number 4, it's Fading Hope. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant, and it bounces a creature. If that creature had a mana value of 3 or less, you get to scry 1. This card greatly resembles Play with Fire. Like it, it's a super cheap, super simple instant, and a strictly better version of a classic Magic card. While Play with Fire is better than Shock, Fading Hope is better than Unsummon. Paying 1 to bounce a creature tends to be a pretty nice deal in many decks, and notably, you can use this on your opponent's creatures or your own. Bouncing tokens can be particularly nice since they will disappear entirely, and you'll always get to scry when you bounce one. It was heavily played in Standard, partly because you were just as likely to find it in tempo decks as you were in control decks. It's not quite as much of a staple in Pioneer, and it's one of the few cards on this list that probably has its best days behind it. But it does see play in the format, in spell decks like Arclight Phoenix and tempo decks like Spirits. At number 3, it's Memory Deluge. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant that lets you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the amount of mana you spent on it, and you can put 2 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library. It also has flashback for 5 generic and 2 blue. So when you cast it normally, you look at the top 4, and when you flash it back, you look at the top 7. Memory Deluge has a pretty good impression of Dig Through Time, one of the best card draw spells ever. While it's never going to be quite as cheap as Dig Through Time can be, it actually gives you even more cards over the course of a game, assuming you manage to cast it twice, and you often do. This is a control player's dream, especially because it's an instant. The card selection means you not only get card quantity, you also get whatever cards are best for a given situation, making it feel really powerful every time you cast it. This has made the Deluge more than powerful enough to see heavy play in control decks in multiple formats, including Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. It's going to keep gaining points in the future, but so too are the cards in front of it. At number 2, it's the Meat Hook Massacre, the card I bet most of you thought would be at number 1. For X and 2 black, this legendary enchantment gives each creature -X until end of turn when it enters the battlefield. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and whenever an opponent's creature dies, you gain 1 life. Having an enchantment as a sweeper is pretty sweet, because you not only gain life and lower your opponent's life the turn this comes down, the enchantment sticks around and continues to deliver sweet, sweet value. This also means that this is a sweeper that both pressures your opponent's life total and makes it harder for you to die. In other words, if someone resolves one of these, they're probably going to win, or at the very least, they're not going to be dying anytime soon. The Meat Hook Massacre dominated Standard during the time it was legal there, making black control decks way too good. So, Meat Hook Massacre got banned out of the format. It's been plenty good for other 60-card formats too. It's found success in mono-black control decks in Pioneer too, and it's also frequently a sideboard card in the format. It also benefited from the release of Modern Horizons 3. While it had already seen some play in the format even before this year, the printing of Necro Dominance has been really good news for the Massacre in the format. These decks are all about using that enchantment to draw tons of cards, and you need to gain life to really go off with it, and the Meat Hook Massacre does that for you while also wiping the board. It also has a single point in Legacy, but it hasn't secured a consistent home for itself in that particular format, but it's going to continue to amass tons of top 8s in both Modern and Pioneer. However, the card in front of it will probably always be number 1, and that card is Consider. The third 1-mana instant on the list, this one costs 1 blue mana. It surveils 1 and draws you a card. It's certainly simple and not very exciting, but paying 1 mana for this effect is a big deal. Surveil is a surprisingly strong mechanic in the right deck, since it not only improves your card quality, it can help you load the graveyard, and that last part has been pretty darn important for Consider. Paying 1 mana, putting 2 cards in the graveyard, and drawing a card is a surprisingly powerful play. It didn't actually see tons of play in Standard, as there weren't that many ways to leverage the graveyard or super cheap instants at the time, but it's seen play in every other 60-card format it's ever been legal in. One of its most common running mates in both Pioneer and Modern is Arclight Phoenix, a creature that loves cheap spells and can come back from the graveyard, so it's a perfect fit. Modern has been the format where it's been the most successful though, by far. There, it not only sees play alongside Arclight Phoenix, but also Murktide Regent, another graveyard and spell-loving creature. More recently, it's been played in Psychic Frog decks in the format. That's another creature that loves loading the graveyard and drawing you cards. In Legacy, it's often featured in Doomsday decks, which look to quickly shrink their deck and win with Thassa's Oracle, and Consider can help you get there after you cast Doomsday, since spending 1 mana to get 2 cards deep is really efficient, and in Vintage, it sees play alongside Underworld Breach, another card that likes cheap spells in the graveyard. It's also seen a lot of play in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, where it's simply one of the best draw spells in the format. Consider is going to keep on putting up top 8s in every format it's legal in, and for that reason, no card on this list, not even the Meat Hook Massacre, has any hope of ever passing it. I think Consider will be the number 1 card on this list forever. So those are the top 10 cards from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. If you want to own any of these spooky cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to catch up on old videos, including old Halloween-inspired MTG top 10s from years past, as well as videos that look at specific sets, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.